Hello, everyone. My name is Kyler Langbart. I'm a current graduate student in agricultural communications and education with an option in teaching license. I've always thought about what teaching could look like past, the post-secondary life, and I actually graduated this past May with a degree in agricultural communications and journalism from K-State, but knew the time was right to try to obtain that teacher's license. So started graduate school with hopes of teaching in a high school agricultural education class in the future. So that's enough about me. Let's go ahead and get started with the case. So I was assigned Honig versus Doe. So this was a pretty impactful case when it comes to special education in the United States. So I'll give you a bit of background first, and then we'll move on to a timeline of events, and finally what the decision was and what impact that holds on special education to this day. So when we think about the background of this case, there are two big who's when it comes to this case. And so both of those names are actually aliases for the actual students' names. They wanted to keep them out of the spotlight. So both names I'll be mentioning are given by the court system. So first of all, it was John Doe, an emotionally disturbed 17-year-old who had difficulty controlling his impulses and anger. So John Doe was a student in the San Francisco United School District in the 1980s, specifically in November 1980s when this incident occurred. But John Doe was the 17-year-old student who was being taunted by another student and had these emotional disturbances. And so when this student taunted him, he decided that he would choke the student, and then while he was being taken to the principal's office, kicked out a window. And so he was initially suspended for 5 days, but then the San Francisco United School District Student Placement Committee decided that it was recommending his expulsion from school and that his suspension would remain indefinite until they could hold expulsion hearings for that student, for John Doe. And so this initially happened, and then actually in the same time period, Jack Smith, who was a middle school age student, also who had emotional disturbances and was a student in the San Francisco United School District. It's worth noting that John and Jack were not students in the same school, just in the same school district. Jack had a similar instance. So once Jack entered middle school, he started misbehaving a little bit more, and eventually he started stealing money from classmates, made sexual comments to female students, and had a tough time handling those emotions. And so he was also placed on a 5-day suspension, and then eventually the student placement committee recommended his expulsion. Similar to John Doe, decided that his suspension would remain indefinite until the expulsion hearings could be held and a decision be made. So Jack Smith's grandparents heard about John Doe and his efforts to organize a civil case against the San Francisco United School District. And so these two individuals and their families joined together to bring a court case to the district level, which I'll explain here in a bit. So here's a bit of a timeline for this whole case. So like I mentioned, it was November 1980 when these two incidents occurred, and these individuals ended up joining together in a suit to try to reestablish these students into school and overturn that suspended indefinitely and eventually an expulsion hearing. So in the early 1980s, this court case was brought to a district court, and the district court actually decided that they would bar the San Francisco United School District from suspending students with disabilities for school for more than 5 days when their misconduct was disability related. So they also prohibited changing a student's placement during these proceedings, and that the state had to provide services directly to eligible students if the local educational facilities failed to do so. For the schools could no longer handle these two students, that it was the responsibility of the state to provide that education for them. And This was eventually brought to a Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, where they affirmed these orders, and actually they modified it a little bit. They modified 5 days to 10 days. So same ruling, they just allowed schools to no longer suspend students for more than 10 days at this time. So after these district court rulings and the appeals process, Honig, who was the representative for the San Francisco United School District, sought the review of the case by the Supreme Court and started the process through the Supreme Court. And it wasn't until 1987 when the case actually was heard by the Supreme Court for the first time. And then it was in the late 1987 when that was heard, and then early 1988 when the decision was made finally. And that decision was that the court ruled in favor of the students. The court ruled 6-2 in favor that the students should be reinstated after 10 days. So during this process, they actually discovered that John Doe's case had become moot at this point because he was no longer in the San Francisco United School District. At the time of the hearing, at the time of the hearing, he was in high school, but when it was heard by the Supreme Court, he was 21 years of age, and so he was no longer a member of the school district, so they found it moot. But Jack Smith, who still was a part of the school district at this point because he was a middle schooler when it first began and then eventually a high schooler when this case got to the Supreme Court, that's the case that they qualified this under. So the basic idea is that under the IDEA Act that we learned about previous in this class, students who qualify and hold an individual education plan cannot be suspended for more than 10 days unless it involves drugs or serious bodily harm. And so that's a big point about this act, is that it really provides students who struggle or have these handicaps with their disabilities that cause disruptions in classrooms. They have this protection that unless there is serious bodily injury imminent for other students, so they cannot be suspended for more than 10 days. But the court did uphold that 10 days idea. They talked about how it's a cooling down period, and so it gives educators a time to initiate a IEP review and do some work with the child's parents to ensure that when they come back to this environment, it's safe for everyone involved. And so, like I said, this gives some leverage to those students with disabilities, so that way they have this protection. But the court also wanted to ensure that the educators who may face these issues in the future have ways of ensuring that if these situations do escalate to a level where students are at risk, students and educators are at risk, that they can take action. And so this ruling has been held up to today. We continue to hold up these rulings, and so it continues to impact special education to this day. Thank you, everyone.